Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Ashok. It's a real honor and a privilege to be here today. Just to add a little bit to my biog, I spent many years of my, so about 10 years of my late childhood, early adulthood, going in and out of psychiatric hospital as a detained patient. And for anyone who doubts the existence and impact of racism in our psychiatric services, I would recommend you spend 6 months as a detained patient on an acute psychiatric inpatient ward, because it will change your life and attitude towards race, mental health, and mental health services. My frustration with today's topic, my topic, the alternatives to mental health at detention, is that we have known since the inception of the 1983 Mental Health Act that it is disproportionately used on some ethnic groups. We have known this from its predecessor acts. We know it from the implementation of the Act. We've known it from every single review of the 1983 Mental Health Act, and there have been a number. And yet we are still disproportionately detaining particularly Black men in this legislation. And I suppose I want to focus on two issues around that for this presentation, and at least propose some of the ways in which we might step towards addressing these problems. And I'll start by giving a little bit of background as to the kind of experiences and learning I've gone through to bring me to the conclusions I'm presenting today. The first one is I've hugely benefited from, in particular, two people's time, patience, teasing, ribbing, and all sorts of good-natured nudging and education throughout this process. Colin is one of them, and Jayashri Kalatil is another. And without their input, I'd still be. I just wouldn't understand whiteness as a race issue, let alone Blackness as a race issue. So I just want to take this opportunity of extending my gratitude towards Jayashri and Colin in particular. Secondly, I was a member of one of the expert topic groups on the latest review of the Mental Health Act. That I was part of the expert topic group looking at why rates of detention are increasing, mental health at detention are increasing, and why some groups are disproportionately likely to be detained. And part of that, we did extensive discussion. I mean, we did everything from statistical analysis to extensive discussions with the people who are making these detention decisions day in, day out. It is absolutely clear that racism does exist within psychiatry, but it's also absolutely clear that the racism starts beyond psychiatry and is reflected and reinforced by psychiatric practice. And what that means is that any solutions that we use to address these problems absolutely have to address the issues within psychiatry, but they have to start beyond psychiatry. They have to start with what's going on in broader society first, because it will not solve the problem even if we manage to break down all the challenges within psychiatry. And the most common reason cited by psychiatrists about why they disproportionately detain young Black men, when we explicitly asked groups of them this question, was that and this was doubly so in the case of things like community treatment orders, which Colin mentioned earlier. It is that they felt, or they expressed the view that if they did not detain people, and if they did not subsequently put them on community treatment orders, they would get no support at all. And that takes a huge amount of unpacking, and I don't have time, and we don't have time today to unpack all of the stuff that sits within that. But we do need to create the space to unpick that kind of thinking and approach, because it is really quite prevalent and is definitely one of these underpinning causes that is leading these excess detentions. And what it says to me in terms of where I sit and where the Mental Health Foundation sit is that we need to start our thinking on racism and whiteness and blackness in the public mental health space, in the public health space, out there in the wide world first. And I think there are 4 things that we can do in that space that will really help to shift our thinking, and more particularly our behavior, when it comes to this excessive detention under Mental Health Act legislation. I should stop and pause and briefly say at this point that I think the easiest and simplest way of solving all these problems would be to simply not have a Mental Health Act. I really genuinely don't quite understand what the benefit of a Mental Health Act is in modern society today, and I really don't understand the justification for the inherent discrimination that says it is legal and proper to force people with a particular condition to be detained and to be treated against their will. And I genuinely don't understand why we're doing that in this day and age. If we stopped doing that, we would, at a stroke, remove the problem of excessive detention of young black men by default. However, that would in itself not be sufficient to deal with all the problems that we currently have. I'm just going to throw 4 things into the pot as possible approaches that I think would genuinely lead to reduced detention, reduced Mental Health Act detentions, and particularly amongst people, particularly amongst young black men, but not exclusively. And I think the advantage of doing these things is that although they would primarily benefit young black men, they would actually benefit everybody. And so many things that we do that are progressive in thought, but targeted at improving the lot of those that get the worst out of life and processes, are that they benefit everybody. So the first one I would run with is much more peer support for people who hear voices. I convene the Educational Voice Hearers Network at the Collaborating Centre for Values-Based Practice. And what's important to us is that hearing voices is a really important life experience that can be both beneficial and can be deeply troubling. And it so often gets pathologized as a symptom of psychosis. And that is very often the starting point for these detention narratives. If we were better at providing constructive, genuine, and I would say peer-led support for people who hear voices, and that was my experience growing up, then that would at a stroke take huge numbers of people out of even being considered by psychiatry, because the challenges of living with voices, so many of them can be addressed by sharing and learning from the experience of people who are constructively living with voices. Secondly, using public mental health approaches to reduce what I think of as preventable trauma. We hear a lot now about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed services, and understanding the relationship between deteriorating mental health, triggering what gets called mental ill health, and exposure to trauma. And it's really important that we understand just how broad that trauma might be. And the 2 examples of preventable uncomfortable trauma that I would highlight that are most pertinent to this, the topic under discussion today, are bullying and racism. And if we could actually take public mental health approaches to reducing the trauma causing racism and the trauma causing bullying, then we would have an enormous positive effect on reducing the number of people who then got tipped from a challenging life into what gets pathologized as mental ill health. Thirdly, I would say we need a layer of work that sits in this kind of primary care space that isn't about GPs. And I've been hugely impressed by some primary care support teams that I've come across. And what these teams do is that they work with people who have classically ended up with a GP, with a in quite severe distress, and the GP responds by giving a psychiatric diagnosis and prescribing medication. And what's happened in a number of places where these teams have been introduced is rather than a GP trying to deal with this in the 2 minutes that they have available, there's a primary care support team that actually starts to unpick what it is that's causing this distress. And it may be bullying, it may be domestic abuse, it may be racism, it may be debt, it may be poor housing. But what these teams do is that they actually start trying to deal with the social determinants of that distress directly, rather than pathologizing them and treating them as symptoms that then need a medical treatment. Now, they do this within a primary care setting, which means if there is additionally needed clinical support, it's there and on hand. But what they found is that this hugely reduced their prescribing, hugely reduced their diagnoses, and actually provided much better practical support for people. And finally, point 4, the one service that is closest to psychiatry, classic mental health services, that has really impressed me is street triage teams. And I think, oh, lovely, thank you. So, and street triage teams, for those that are not familiar, typically consist of a police officer and a mental health professional, and they respond to a call that goes to that primarily goes to the police, that classically ends in a detention under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. And what these street triage teams do is that they respond to that report, and they go out and they meet the person who is there, and they assess whether this is a criminal justice issue. They assess whether it is a mental health issue, or indeed some other issue entirely, but they do not leave that person until a satisfactory resolution has been found. And that particular, I spent 2 nights out with that street triage team, and that particular team, since their inception, they have reduced the detentions under their under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act by 80%, 80%, just by responding to those calls in that way. That's and thank you for pulling up that slide. Those are my kind of 4 key findings from thinking on this, and I think that's probably pretty much the end of my time. So if you're happy, Ashok, I'll call it a halt there.